I just bought a new monitor, a 480Hz 1440p OLED, but before I even plugged it in, a question started to burn in my mind. How much better was it really? I was already on a 390Hz LCD. Was it worth the money? I was going to run some quick tests, get a good enough answer to convince myself, and then move on. But as I began testing, it only raised more questions.
How big of a difference will 1440p
OLED
make
has such
over
good
1080?
clarity.
OLED better than LCD? How does this suboptimal visual does it still matter about your
I got carried away. Before I knew it, I was wearing a lab coat, and I had bought a second monitor arm to make testing easier. I was committed. I used my experience as a top 1v1er in Overwatch to design a custom suite of purpose-built tests to isolate variables. I was gonna find the truth of the matter one way or another. The slow-mo footage demonstrates the basic idea of why a higher refresh is important. Lower refresh panels tend to show ghosting or blur on fast-moving objects. Here's a common test used to compare monitors. I adjusted my camera settings to try and get the most realistic representation possible. In the LCD picture, you can distinguish each of the white dots, but they are significantly blurred into each other. Also, there's a lot of smearing off the back edge of the UFO. Actually, in real life, that smearing looks even worse. In the OLED picture, the white dots are easy to distinguish, but you can still perceive some blur between them. There is zero smearing off the back edge of the UFO. But we all knew that a camera could pick up the differences between two panels. What we really want to know is how it affects player performance. To do that, there's only one way: playing the same scenarios over and over and collecting a lot of data. First, I wanted to get a general picture under simple, ideal circumstances. I knew motion blur and ghosting would be most noticeable during a flick, but a flick by itself might not reveal much, since the eyes might pick up all the information they need before initiating that single mouse correction. Therefore, the strongest test should be a scenario where you're forced to track immediately after a flick. Book Club Advanced Blink was perfect for this. It was also a reading focus scenario, meaning my ability to comprehend what's on the screen would be the most important thing rather than my raw mouse control. To perform the tests, I'd play the scenario once on each monitor configuration before switching to the next. This was tedious, but minimized any outside variables like learning effects or fatigue. I also took breaks at regular intervals and did my best to dedicate full focus on every run. Initially, I included 390Hz plus blur reduction as a test group. However, I quickly realized that my monitor's blur reduction was clearly hurting more than it helped. Although it did reduce blur without crosstalk, it reduced the brightness of the monitor so much that I was scoring lower with it on than with it off. Because of that, I dropped it to save time. It would take weeks to conduct all these tests, so I couldn't afford to test anything superfluous. After I finished all the runs, I ran the stats and was a bit shocked by the results. But before taking a closer look at that, I should explain how I draw conclusions from noisy data like aim trainer scores. If you don't care, use the chapters to skip to the results. Data that has a lot of random variance like this often ends up fitting what's called a normal distribution. You've probably seen one of these before, for plotting stuff like height or IQ. I'm going to plot the data from one of the monitor settings and see if it matches a normal distribution. I created buckets for the scores. On the vertical axis is the frequency, how many times we got a score within a given bucket. After plotting the data, you can see it vaguely fits the right shape, with a hump in the middle. It's not exact because I didn't do enough trials to totally average out all the noise. However, it is close enough to fit a normal distribution to it with pretty good accuracy. Something like this. This is basically taking the data we do have and figuring out what the distribution would have looked like if we had done enough trials. At the ends here, these tails actually go off to infinity, approaching but not reaching zero. And we can use this fact to make accurate predictions outside the range of our data. For example, what if we wanted to know the best score I would have gotten in 10,000 trials, assuming my performance level remained the same? What's even better is that we can compare multiple distributions against each other like this, to get an idea of how big a difference these settings actually made. For example, if you take a look at the peak of the 480Hz OLED curve, which is the average score of that setting, you can see where it lines up with the curve of the 144Hz LCD results. This is pretty far on the right, meaning it's an unlikely result. After doing the math, it works out to 97th percentile. In other words, only my top 3% scores on 144Hz were equal to the average of my 480Hz scores. And to compare apples to apples, only the top fourth of my scores with the 240Hz OLED match the average of the 480Hz OLED scores. Now if we look at the right end of the graph, where all the other settings have trailed off to negligible figures, there's still a reasonable probability of getting a score out here on the 480Hz OLED. And this is supported by the data I got, because I hit a new personal best during testing. The new PB was 1867, smashing the previous PB of 1773. If we check the score against the probability distributions, we get a great but not incredible 99.7th percentile, or 1 in 326, for the 480Hz OLED. However, for the other settings, the probabilities are much worse. 1 in nearly 16,000 for the 390Hz, and 1 in nearly 3 million for the 144Hz. Again, take the exact numbers with a grain of salt because the data was noisy. However, it does give a roughly accurate representation of the differences. My goal here was to see if there was a real, meaningful difference, rather than put a perfectly precise number on how big the differences are. The next thing I wanted to check was if these trends hold up in pure flick scenarios. As mentioned earlier, I was skeptical. However, you do have some control over where your flick will end up even after initiating it, so I thought the results might surprise me. I had previously created a scenario called True Flick, which scores you not just on your accuracy but also your speed to kill the target, so that you're actually pushed to flick rather than use controlled drag shots. For testing, I made a new variant where the targets don't move after spawning. Since I already established that my OLED is better than my LCD, I just tested different refresh rates on my OLED. The average scores did sort themselves based on refresh rate, but due to a high standard deviation of the scores, the differences between each average are not statistically significant. I suspect that if I had run 3 or 4 times as many trials, we'd start to see statistical significance, but I had to pick my battles, and this was enough to convince me that the refresh rate has a minimal impact on pure flicks. Moving forward, I wanted to see the impact of the top-end specs in more challenging visual situations. How would the gap between 480Hz and 240Hz on the OLED grow or shrink when visibility in the game is poor? I identified 3 main types of in-game clarity issues: color and lighting, resolution or blur, and clutter. I had previously created a custom game mode in Overwatch called Recording Studio. It allows the player to record movements and actions and play them back with a bot. I modified the code to facilitate monitor trials. If I hit a hotkey, the bot respawns in a set location and plays a dodge pattern, starting from a random point in the pattern. My time to kill is then recorded. Because this was a new scenario and learning effects could distort the data, I first played it 100 times just to learn the scenario, before running it another 100 times for the actual test. In the end, my average score on 480Hz was significantly better than it was on 240Hz, but not to a greater degree than it was on the Book Club Advanced Blink test earlier. In other words, the reduced color and lighting clarity of this test did not make a higher refresh any stronger or weaker than it is under ideal visual conditions. Next, I wanted to see if visual clutter would affect the gap between 240Hz and 480Hz. I had previously created another custom game mode called QQ100. It features a Mercy bot that can use Guardian Angel to move evasively. The second form of the bot spams short strafes with vertical movements. I had noticed previously that the outline of Form 2 is hard to see, especially the head. I modified the code to add extra effects on the Mercy to make it even harder to distinguish her outline. I also turned off player outlines and the character's name and health bar, so that I'd actually have to see the player model to aim. Once again, 480Hz outperformed 240Hz by roughly the same amount. Finally, I wanted to see how 1440p would compare to 1080p at long range. It took a bit of experimentation, but I settled on this as the test. Shooting a Reinhardt bot, headshot only. This might seem strange, but Rein's head is actually extremely hard to see under these conditions, because it's nestled between his shoulders. To avoid blur or the benefit of extra pixels on the 1080p test, I turned off scaling, so the game looked exactly how it would on a native 1080p OLED monitor. This test surprised me the most. Despite the fact that I could discern the target much easier in 1440p, sometimes it actually felt harder to read the target's movements. It is possible that my brain hasn't adapted to the increased visual information of a higher resolution, or that my test scenario is just flawed. The target's lean animations don't change after all, so perhaps it was too easy to intuit the location of the head without needing to discern it clearly. In any case, 1440p did outperform 1080p, but not quite to the degree of statistical significance after 100 runs. I am genuinely surprised by this result because I've struggled to see targets at long range on 1080p, and I still fully expect it to be easier on 1440p in many situations. If you guys have any ideas for a better test of resolution, let me know in the comments. Okay, let's look at a summary of overall results. Higher refresh rate correlated strongly with better scores on all scenarios tested, except pure flicks. which still correlated but only weakly. My OLED performed better than my LCD, with or without its blur reduction. A better blur reduction implementation might fare better. Realistic and difficult in-game visual conditions did not make the gap in performance between higher and lower refresh rates shrink or grow. 480Hz still significantly outperformed 240Hz, but not any more than it had on the aim trainer test with ideal visuals. 1440p did confer an advantage over 1080p at long range, but the results were just shy of statistical significance in my testing. In general, the strong impact of refresh rates above 240Hz was a bit surprising to me, and I fully expected visual clutter and poor color conditions to cause refresh rates to become even more important, but that wasn't the case. Subjectively, 480Hz at 1440p on an OLED compared to 390Hz at 1080p on an LCD was like night and day for me for in-game clarity, especially at long range. There are so many more details I can make out that it's a bit overwhelming. I think once I get a chance to actually play on the monitor rather than just running tests, I'll see even bigger benefits. This video took a long time, but I learned a lot. If you thought it was informative, please consider sharing it with a friend and giving it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching to the end, and goodbye.